Somewhere beneath the dark water of a major Oklahoma reservoir, dam infrastructure disappears into blackness and submerged trees stand like skeletons nobody bothered to clear before the water rose. Generations of Oklahoma anglers have told stories about what supposedly lives down there. Near the deepest holes at Lake Texoma, the story grew until people were describing catfish the size of a bus, animals so enormous that divers who claimed to encounter them refused to go back down. Similar legends took root around Lake Eufaula and other big Oklahoma impoundments. Oklahoma fisheries biologists have heard every version of these stories, and they say plainly that the bus-sized fish is folklore, nothing more. No verified specimen, no measured weight, no scientific record backs up any of the truly extreme versions passed around at boat ramps and bait shops. For a moment, let that kill the mystery entirely. No monster, no bus-sized catfish lurking under any dam in the state. But Oklahoma scientists once did something far more interesting than repeat a fish story. They opened the stomachs of more than 1,300 real giant predators pulled from these same lakes, and what they found inside is a better story than the legend ever was. If your family has an old story about a giant catfish from a specific Oklahoma lake, put the name of it in the comments, because that's exactly the kind of local folklore this investigation is trying to trace back to something real. The real giant is the flathead catfish, Pylodictis olivaris, and Oklahoma wildlife officials describe it as common through most of the state's large reservoirs and streams, a species that has been sharing these waters with anglers for as long as anyone alive has been fishing them, long before any bus-sized legend ever got told. Adult flatheads occupy exactly the kind of habitat that keeps giant catfish legends alive, generation after generation. Deep holes, submerged logs, brush piles, undercut banks, the sort of structure an angler can fish directly over for 20 years without ever seeing what's actually resting beneath the boat. And unlike the slow bottom scavenging most people picture when they hear the word catfish, adult flatheads are genuinely active predators. Oklahoma's own wildlife agency states they feed mainly on live fish and crayfish, not scraps and decay. The agency also confirms the number that makes this story worth telling in the first place. Flatheads can exceed 100 pounds. That's an impressive weight on its own, and it's worth remembering that reaching that size takes many years of steady growth in the right reservoir conditions, which is exactly why fish anywhere near that class remain rare enough to make headlines when someone actually lands one. But body size alone doesn't tell you what role a predator actually plays inside a lake's food web. To answer that question, scientists had to look inside the fish themselves, one stomach at a time. That's exactly what happened across 6 of Oklahoma's major reservoirs: Carl Blackwell, Eufaula, Fort Gibson, Grand, Hudson, and Texoma. 6 lakes spread across very different parts of the state, with very different prey communities living in each one. Researchers collected adult flatheads using gill nets and trammel nets, and by the time the study was finished, they had examined 1,329 individual fish, a scale of sampling that puts this well beyond anecdote and into the territory of a genuinely serious ecological dataset. Food turned up in roughly 47% of those stomachs, and that number deserves a quick word of context before moving on, because an empty stomach doesn't mean the study failed. Predators don't feed constantly. Digestion works at different speeds depending on prey type and water temperature, and the timing of when a fish happened to get caught relative to its last meal varies constantly from one individual to the next. The real information in this study comes from what researchers found in the stomachs that did contain identifiable prey, and once all of that material got sorted, weighed, and counted across all 6 lakes combined, one category overwhelmed almost everything else on the list. Fish made up more than 95% of both the total prey volume and the total number of prey items recovered across all 6 reservoirs. That statistic alone should change how anyone pictures this species. This isn't a bottom-feeding scavenger picking at whatever settles near it, the image most people carry around from childhood fishing trips or half-remembered nature documentaries. In Oklahoma's major reservoirs, the adult flathead catfish functions as an overwhelmingly piscivorous predator, built almost entirely around eating other fish rather than scavenging debris off the bottom. But before that number turns into something scarier than it actually is, it needs a second question attached to it immediately. Which fish? Because 95% fish sounds, on first hearing, like every bass and crappie in the lake should be terrified, and the actual stomach contents tell a much more specific and much less alarming story than that first impression suggests. Gizzard shad dominated the diet more than any other single prey category, representing somewhere between 49.5 and 91.7% of total stomach volume, depending on which reservoir you're looking at. A range wide enough to show just how much local availability shapes what these fish actually end up eating. Freshwater drum came in as the second major category, contributing roughly 3.3 to 38.2% depending on the lake. Carp mattered heavily in specific reservoirs, showing up as a substantial share of stomach volume at Lake Eufaula and Lake Hudson, while barely registering at all in some of the other systems sampled, a difference researchers linked directly to how abundant carp happened to be in each individual body of water rather than any inherent preference on the flatheads' part. At Fort Gibson Reservoir specifically, channel catfish made up about 13.8% of stomach volume, almost certainly because channel cats happened to be unusually abundant in that particular lake at the time. A clear pattern starts to emerge once you line all of that up side by side. These flatheads were not randomly devouring whatever species swam past. They were exploiting whichever prey happened to be locally abundant in each individual reservoir, which is a very different portrait than the vague, indiscriminate monster the folklore usually describes. A predator built around opportunity rather than obsession, adjusting its menu lake by lake based on what the water actually offered it, is a far more biologically believable animal than one that simply devours everything in sight regardless of what's actually available to it. Which brings up the question anyone who fishes these lakes for sport is going to ask immediately. What about bass, crappie, and sunfish, the species anglers actually spend their weekends chasing? The fish that show up on tournament leaderboards and family fish fries alike. In the 3 reservoirs where center archids showed up in the sampled stomachs in measurable amounts, they combined for only about 5.4 to 10% of total stomach volume. Set that next to gizzard shad reaching past 90% in some of those same lakes, and the picture sharpens considerably. A giant predator consuming enormous quantities of fish across its lifetime does not automatically mean it's destroying the fishery humans care most about. Predation is a normal part of how a healthy reservoir food web actually functions. And abundant forage fish like shad exist in part precisely because predators like this one are consuming them in large numbers. Nothing in the original Oklahoma research supported turning the flathead into an ecological villain, and this documentary isn't going to manufacture one where the data doesn't support it either. A healthy reservoir needs predators consuming its forage base just as much as it needs the forage base itself, and treating this fish as a threat simply because it eats efficiently misreads what predation actually does inside a functioning ecosystem. Before moving forward, it's worth pausing on how old that original dataset actually is, because roughly half a century separates it from today, and that gap deserves an honest answer instead of getting glossed over. In 2019, researchers turned their attention to Lake Ellsworth, examining winter diets of large blue and flathead catfish taken from that reservoir. A decision driven partly by the same lingering question the original 6 reservoir study had left open decades earlier. The flathead sample, with usable stomach contents, was considerably smaller than the historic 6 reservoir dataset, so this newer study functions as corroboration rather than a full replacement for it. Even so, the findings lined up in a familiar direction. Among the flatheads sampled, freshwater drum turned up most frequently, while white crappie represented the largest single share by prey weight within that smaller subsample. Gizzard shad and sunfish also appeared, though at lower rates. That produces an interesting modern wrinkle. Yes, a genuine sport species, white crappie, clearly can end up as prey for a large flathead, but one winter's worth of sampling from a single lake cannot responsibly be stretched into a statewide conclusion about population-level impact. The researchers behind that Lake Ellsworth study said as much themselves. concluding that additional work across more Oklahoma reservoirs would be genuinely valuable for understanding how large catfish affect the broader fish community around them. Half a century after the original stomach study, the underlying biology hadn't changed. These fish are still doing exactly what their physiology and their position in the food web predict, quietly consuming whatever the local prey base makes available, decade after decade, largely unnoticed by anyone standing on the bank above them. So how big does the real version of this predator actually get today? Forget the bus, forget the man-eating campfire version. The verified scale is still remarkable on its own terms. In 2024, a flathead weighing around 95 pounds was pulled from Pine Creek Reservoir in Oklahoma. Picture that weight honestly for a second. Not bus-sized, not anywhere close to dangerous to a person, but an enormous freshwater predator, easily capable of disappearing completely beneath a submerged tree, a bluff bank, or an old flooded river channel, invisible to anyone fishing the water directly above it. Oklahoma fisheries biologist Matt Mock has pointed out that these giant catfish legends keep clustering specifically around dams and deep water because that kind of unseen depth is exactly the sort of place imagination naturally rushes in to fill. Nobody can see the bottom near a dam face, so nobody can immediately disprove whatever story someone decides to tell about it. And that same unseen quality that fuels the folklore is precisely what let the actual science go unnoticed for just as long. And that observation is the bridge into the real point of this entire investigation, because it explains something the folklore never bothered to ask. Why do these legends always seem to gather around the same handful of locations, the same dam faces, the same deep bends in the same handful of well-known lakes, generation after generation, instead of spreading evenly across every stretch of water in the state? Because here's the part that actually deserves correcting. Fishermen never stopped talking about giant Oklahoma catfish. The Texoma legends alone prove that clearly enough, and anyone who has spent an evening at a boat ramp listening to old-timers compare notes knows the subject never actually left the conversation. Old river anglers still swap stories about fish lost at the boat, lines broken by something too heavy to land, and weights that sound more impressive with every retelling. And more than one Oklahoma fisheries biologist has joked about watching a 5-pound fish grow into a 20, 30, or 40-pound legend purely through repetition, each retelling adding a little more weight the same way a fish story always does everywhere it's told. What actually faded out of that conversation wasn't the giant fish itself, it was the ecology sitting underneath it. The far less dramatic, but far more consequential question that never made it into a single campfire story. Decades before any of these modern stories got repeated online, Oklahoma scientists had already documented something more interesting than any bus-sized rumor. Adult flatheads across 6 major reservoirs were feeding almost entirely on fish, their specific prey shifting from lake to lake based on whatever happened to be locally abundant. And modern researchers are still working to figure out exactly what a predator that size, sustained over decades, actually means for an entire reservoir's fish community. The forgotten question was never, how big can the monster get? It's what does a predator this large do to a lake over 20 or 30 years of quietly eating? Return to that same dark reservoir one more time. Same boat, same submerged timber disappearing into black water below, but take the impossible monster out of the picture entirely. In its place, a real flathead, maybe 50 pounds, maybe 70, maybe, under the right conditions, pushing past the 100-pound mark, resting in exactly the kind of structure that made the old legends feel plausible in the first place. The evidence never supported a creature destroying Oklahoma's lakes. It points towards something quieter and honestly more interesting than that. A large native predator whose adult life revolves overwhelmingly around eating other fish, whose specific diet bends toward whatever prey each individual reservoir happens to supply in abundance, capable of consuming shad, drum, carp, channel catfish, and even crappie, while remaining almost completely invisible beneath the surface the entire time, undetected by anyone except the researchers willing to actually open its stomach and look. The folklore only ever asked how big can it get. The science asks the harder, more consequential question. What happens when something that large spends decades doing exactly that, feeding steadily through an entire reservoir's food web year after year, and Oklahoma researchers still don't have a complete answer for every reservoir in the state, which is exactly the kind of open question good science leaves behind instead of pretending to have closed. If you've caught or seen a large flathead in an Oklahoma lake or river, tell us which one, roughly how much it weighed if you actually got it on a scale, and whether you noticed anything about what it had been eating. And if you want more of these investigations that trade folklore for actual evidence, subscribe, because Oklahoma's lakes are still holding on to ecological questions nobody has fully answered yet.